Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the historic Traverse City Opera House. I'm Jill Tousley with the National Writers Series. At the end of February, just a couple weeks ago, we kicked off the National Writers Series 2014 Winter-Spring season with Kelly Corrigan, which is for sure an Irish name. Now, you may not be able to tell from my name, Jill Tousley. My maiden name was actually Johnson, but I do have a wee bit of Irish blood in me. And I also happen to have a lot of book-loving blood in me. So I think that today, this St. Patrick's Day, this is a perfect way to celebrate a holiday. I'm wondering, are there any other Irish book lovers in the audience tonight? Okay, good. The National Writers Series is a not-for-profit organization. And the revenue from the events that we have here in the Historic Opera House support the National Writers Series Scholarship Fund, which has awarded in excess of $25,000 to college-bound students in the juniors and seniors in nonfiction, fiction, and poetry. It also helps to fund our Front Street Writers Program, which is a tuition-free creative writing intensive for area high school, juniors, and seniors. The Front Street Writers classes take place off campus at a studio located right here in downtown Traverse City during the school day. And the students, like I said, it's tuition free, and they can also earn college credit for taking the course. This is a program that is not happening in many places across the country, but it's happening right here in Traverse City. And another cool thing that happens is a lot of our visiting authors actually visit those students in that classroom to teach those students master classes, which is really wonderful. The National Writers Series and the programs that it supports happen because of all of you. You buy tickets to these events, and it also happens, and it's also possible because of our donors and sponsors. So tonight I want to give special thanks to the FIM group, Fee-Only Wealth Managers, located downtown. They've been a sustaining sponsor of the National Writers Series since 2009, the year we began. Thanks as well to our other major sponsors, Smith Hoey Rice Rogie, Dr. Gum and his associates at Traverse City I, Cherry Capital Airport, and our transportation sponsor, Cherry Capital Subaru Cadillac. Now, in addition, In addition to being a sustaining sponsor, the FIM group will donate 20% of the total book sales this evening back to the Writers Series of Traverse City. And our on-site bookseller, Horizon Books, will also contribute 20% of their book sales back to the Writers Series. These monies help to support Front Street Writers and the National Writers Series Scholarship Program that I just told you about. So I just wanted to say to you, if you're thinking about buying a book tonight, keep in mind that if you do, the FIM group and Horizon Books will donate 20% of that purchase back to the Writers Series. That means if you purchase a $20 worth of books tonight, the National Writers Series will get back $8. And if 100 people tonight purchase $20 worth of books, that's $800. And over 10 events throughout the year, that's $8,000 just for buying books. So just think about, So thank you for your support of the National Writers Series by attending this event tonight, and I hope that we'll see a lot of you purchasing some books later tonight. And with that, I want to say let's get this show on the road.
Thanks. All right. Doug knows I don't believe in daylight savings time. And he bailed on the introduction this morning. So I kind of had to jump in at the last minute. As you can see, I'm not quite ready for this evening. I mean, you can't really make an hour disappear. That's ridiculous. The Mayans couldn't do it. It means that time doesn't matter. And of course, time isn't matter per se, and black holes make time bend, but that's a whole different thing. I'm going to introduce our guest this evening, maybe a little untraditionally. I didn't prepare anything because Doug was going to do the introduction. He prepares very well. He's a good researcher. Maybe you've read his books. I wrote a memoir, so I didn't need to prepare at all for mine. I just had to remember. So I'm going to go with my intuition on who George Packer is. I think he was raised by Bedouins in North Dakota, where he would have raised roosters for Mexican cockfights. He probably spent about 7 years in a penitentiary for crimes, undisclosed crimes against the state, where he taught himself English and learned to write coded messages in haiku, which he turned into his book, The Unwinding. What is truth, really? Actually, he graduated from Yale, and instead of joining an arena rock band in 1982 like I would have, he went to Africa with the Peace Corps for a year, which actually created his first book, about his experience there, called The Village of Waiting. And that led him into a lifetime of seeking the soul of nations, which is a small task. I don't know how he does that. He could have gone smaller, children's books of some kind, but no, he goes after the biggest stuff there is. He tries to figure out who we are as a people in each epoch, in our moments, and he tries to do this by finding individuals who, in essence, characterize the nature of our nations. And he's done it over and over again by seeking out his own past in The Blood of Liberals, which is about his own family. His grandfather was actually a senator, or a congressman in Alabama. And you can see how he's kind of arrived into America by studying its politics, by studying its people, but mostly by studying our hearts. Our mistakes are made when we fail our heart most. And I think the beautiful thing about his latest book, The Unwinding, is that he really goes after who we are right now. It is, we usually do the It Is a Great Pleasure to introduce, but I thought we'd turn it up a notch. And I don't know, this just kind of came to me, as most things do. It is with shock and awe that we celebrate St. Packers Day with the shaman of truth, Mr. George Packer.
I wish I were as interesting as that person who was introduced a moment ago by this inveterate liar, Ben Bush. But I'm not, as you're going to find out in the next hour.
I'm glad not to be reviled in front of my people.
I thought we were going to box. Is that what the bathrobe was about?
Well, bathrobes are misused, I find. I think it's an excellent thing to wear about the neighborhood. Godlike power. It is a great pleasure to have you here in Traverse City.
It's good to be in Traverse City.
Let's talk about how you ventured from Yale into West Africa as a young man in search of what he might find. What drove you to kind of explore that place at a time when the economy was booming and everyone was not going to Africa?
The economy, you're a little younger than I am. The economy was not booming in 1982.
It was going to.
Some people here might remember what was called the Reagan recession. So I graduated at the moment of, until that point, the greatest recession since the Great Depression. We've since outdone ourselves. But why did you join the Marines? I mean, I wanted to see the world. I wanted to do something hard. I wanted to find out who I was. I wanted to be tested. But I was not going to join the Marines for various reasons. Mainly because the idea never remotely occurred to me.
We didn't get to you in time.
You didn't. I barely knew what the Marines were in 1982. It was that long period from Vietnam to Gulf War I and II when people of my generation didn't look to the military really as a way to find yourself. But but I kind of wish I had. Instead, I had my own little hard service overseas. It was in a little village in Togo, and I was there for a year and a half, and it was the loneliest, longest, most perilous experience of my life. It kind of turned me into a writer, I would say. In a way, it turned me into a journalist because I had to learn how to talk to and listen to people who were very different from me. And I found out that I was quite interested in them and good at getting them to talk and to tell me their story and to open up.
And of all things, you were teaching English. That's what you're.
I was. It was the rock bottom of Peace Corps uselessness. What do you do when you graduate from Yale with a degree in Renaissance studies? You
become a Renaissance man.
You go teach English to 10-year-olds in Togo. I mean, the cliche is that you learn more than you ever teach, and that was certainly true in my case. But I didn't become a journalist after that, and it's sort of a long, circuitous route to books like The Unwinding. It took a long time for me to figure out what kind of writer I am. I did a lot of other things as a writer in the meantime, but it was that period on my own in Togo that I think I was hanging on by my fingernails, and it was really those conversations with the villagers and all the notes I was taking in my journal that kind of kept me going.
Do you think, even now that you have retrospect, that it's chaos that best focuses you on how to establish an order? Is it the search through uncertainty that drives you to find some kind of narrative strain, something that you can build around, somehow to find a story?
I never think about it in terms of finding order in chaos so much, but I do look for patterns and I listen, and in listening, I begin to pick up recurring words and themes and questions. You start to find out who the people you're listening to are by, paying careful attention to what they keep coming back to, and then you go off and talk to someone else, and you hear that same story from a different angle or a different take on the same theme, and then you begin to realize there is something that's organizing life here that everyone seems to care about. In Togo, what I began to feel was I started out in a position of they're utterly unlike me. They are living so close to nature. The cycles of the seasons, the cycles of life are everything here. No one seems to have an idea about the future. There was no word for the future in the local language.
Really?
Which when I heard that, it rang a bell like, wow, that makes sense. This is all about circularity, not linearity forward. So I kind of had a fixed idea of, well, this is what peasant life in Africa is like. And then over that year and a half, as I listened, I began to realize that wasn't true. They were in this gray area where that was certainly the life they came out of. But they now knew enough about another kind of life, the life of the city, the life of Lagos, 2 countries over, the life of New York or Paris, that they were, it was a neither nor. And they were all, especially the more educated ones, in a state of a kind of crisis where they didn't quite know who they were because education was taking them away from the village, but there was really no place for them to be educated and to live that life in Togo. It was a little dictatorship. It was kind of a junior version of Mobutu's Zaire. It was a very unpleasant place to be a Togolese, and yet they were beginning to get ideas. And so in a way, they were more like me than I had imagined, and that was an exciting discovery. So that's sort of the trajectory that the Village of Waiting takes you through.
And just the name itself, the Village of Waiting, we're all waiting for what happens next.
Yeah.
You kind of go into that with a number of your books. The Assassin's Gate, of course, about Iraq. The Unwinding itself is kind of it always comes with a sense of forecast, a worry about the coming weather from where we're standing. And so much of the Assassin's Gate for me was prophetic. Of course, I was there the year before you and then the year after you when this book was being written. How is it that you seem so fascinated by what drives people? Is that the essential message you're always seeking when you go into a place you obviously always go into places you don't know, it seems, except for in Blood of Liberals, which was going into your own past. And then
which I didn't really know, actually, as it turned out, until I went into it, and then found there, things more disturbing in some ways than Iraq. Yeah, it's dangerous to find your father's papers in an attic that had been untouched for 20 years and to spend a week reading every word of them. Your father, who you haven't seen, he's been dead. He had been dead for 20 years when I found those papers. So that was, in some ways, the book I had to write. The Assassin's Gate is about ideas and consequences. And it begins with a set of ideas about the war and the people who were formulating those ideas. And some of them became household names, like Paul Wolfowitz and Donald Rumsfeld. And some of them are not well known. Kenan Makia, the Iraqi scholar and writer who wrote Republic of Fear. I was talking to people before the war about what ideas were propelling this event, which seemed to be willed. It did not seem like this has to happen, or history is forcing this to happen, or it's just come and found us, we didn't want it. No, this was something people wanted and sought, and in a way, the idea of the war preceded the rationales for the war. First, we were going to have a war, and then we had to find the reasons for having the war. So I wrote about that set of ideas and arguments, and then I went to Iraq and kept going back for 4 or 5 years, although I wrote The Assassin's Gate in the middle of that, to see what life did these ideas have? What reality did they have? And it turned out that, as a friend of mine, Dexter Filkins, who wrote a wonderful book about the war, the Forever War, said when I met him in Baghdad, ideas make me nervous. They get people killed. And that happened in Iraq. There was this huge gap between the abstractions and the predictions and the false notions of what Iraq was and what the Arab world was and who America was, and then this encounter between these two countries. And what interested me, and more than interested, what obsessed me when I got there, was to see how these two people understood each other. So I wanted to be at the meeting point of Iraqis and Americans. And that was hard to find because the Americans, many of them were hidden away behind multiple perimeters of security in the green zone. The Iraqis were aware that America was in their country and there's a patrol going by, but they never seemed to talk to Americans there was this huge gap between them. And I found that the point of meeting happened probably at about the level where you were, which is to say senior NCOs, junior officers, who actually had to go out and figure out why the garbage wasn't getting picked up, or how can we get water to this neighborhood that's never had piped water, or what do we do about the crime problem? In other words, having to act like administrators. And that is where Americans and Iraqis, I think, first had to encounter each other. So I just spent as much time as I could
right at that juncture.
At that point, sitting through those meetings, going out on those patrols, and it was endlessly interesting and dismaying because you could just see, with the best will in the world,
so much mutual frustration. Yeah.
Goodwill and sorry results. Yeah.
I'm going to read a little piece from Assassin's Gate, and then something that you just wrote in the Unwinding, kind of tying this all together, because of course Iraq is a piece of this period of time that you cover. Rumsfeld's words, which soon became notorious, implied a whole political philosophy. The defense secretary looked upon anarchy and saw the early stages of democracy. In his view, and that of others in the administration, but above all the president, freedom was the absence of constraint. Freedom existed in divinely endowed human nature, not in man-made institutions and laws. Remove a 35-year-old tyranny and democracy will grow in its place, because people everywhere want to be free. There was no contingency for psychological demolition. What had been left out of the planning were the Iraqis themselves. This became very prophetic. And
The
what you
quote
just said,
that sort of precedes that is the famous,
stuff
stuff
happens.
happens, freedom is untidy.
Right.
That's what Rumsfeld said when he was asked about the looting in Baghdad right after the invasion. Yeah.
And then just recently, about this book, The Unwinding, you say, in response to kind of, what do you worry about America now? And you say, you worry that we've lost our nerve, our sense of possibility. It exists in individuals, but it's a private thing. Democracy is very hard, in some ways unnatural. It takes constant effort and learning and recommitment. A lot of people I met while working on The Unwinding no longer think that our democracy has much to offer them. They think the game is rigged and they're not included. It's almost a strange reflection of exactly how Iraq feels now, disenfranchised from its own government process.
In a way, Iraq is part of The Unwinding. But because I'd already written this book, The Assassin's Gate, when I tried to think about how to shape a narrative about 35 years of American institutions starting to fall apart, it seemed like I just couldn't do it. I could not bring the wars into it. There wasn't room. And that's in some ways something missing. There is a sketch of Colin Powell,
There is.
whose life story represents sort of the best of American institutions, recognizing this talent out of the South Bronx and lifting him up through the ranks, and the egalitarian spirit of the military is really evident in the life of Colin Powell. What he didn't understand was that very institution that was his career, he was so devoted to it that he couldn't see that it was being corrupted. And in 2003, he was used by people who were not committed to it as he was, and he allowed them to use him because he was, above all, a great staff officer. He was not someone who was going to go his own way. So the Iraq story is part of this larger story of post-war institutions that had a sort of social contract at their heart beginning to unravel in the last few decades.
From that same experience, you obviously write a lot of essays particularly for The New Yorker. One of those essays, which I read long ago, and the reason I first sent you a message actually, was you wrote a piece called Betrayed about the Iraqi interpreters and how we'd kind of use them for what they were useful for, which was our only way to communicate with an entire country. And then we essentially abandoned them, left them to their fate, and they were all considered traitors. They had worked for the wrong side, even though it was in an earnest effort mostly to help form a new nation. You then turned that into a play. How did that idea come to you, that this essay about Iraqi interpreters was going to be something which could take place on stage?
Yeah, it doesn't seem completely obvious when you think about it. And I'd never had that. Every writer thinks, oh, maybe Hollywood will call, but the idea of actually, oh, you're going to write a play? That didn't seem to follow. Well, what happened was, this came near the end of my period of writing about Iraq.
Right.
It was in 2007. I went back for one last trip specifically to find these people, because I'd begun hearing stories about people I knew or people I knew who knew others. A whole world of these interpreters had either gone underground or was trying to flee the country, or they were actually getting killed because they had the biggest target on them, and they were the most defenseless people in Iraq. They did not have a militia of their own. Right. The Iraqi security forces didn't like them, and we were...
Because they'd had a higher status in the conflict, because they were with the Americans even more so.
They were not trusted, and it showed the incredible depth of mistrust. The Iraqis who were there to facilitate the indispensable dialogue between Americans and Iraqis were considered the most dangerous and untrustworthy people in Iraq. And so they were getting killed. They were being chased out of the country, and we were just washing our hands of it. The official bureaucracy, it was of a piece with everything else in that war. At the higher levels, there was a what? Interpreters? Well, they've done a service for us, and we thank them for it. And if they find they can't live in Iraq, then we don't insist that they continue to work for us. That was it. So I went and found them. It was very hard to find them. It was the rock bottom of January 2007. It was a really scary time.
Now, you were going around on your own, too. You were going in the back streets to find people in their homes, essentially, right?
If they would let me. But by that time, making arrangements was really hard. That had been the way I always worked in Iraq, but by 2007, you had to really go through elaborate preparations like, okay, I'll meet you in the lobby of this hotel, but then we're going to go up to the 11th floor and take a room, because I don't want the desk clerk to see us, because I don't know who the desk clerk is. No one could trust anyone. So we would go up I spent like 2 days in a room in the Palestine Hotel talking to a couple of Iraqis. Another guy who was from Najaf said, I'll meet you at the Baghdad airport and we'll get on flight so-and-so to Erbil, Kurdistan. And we'll talk in Kurdistan, but we're not talking anywhere in Iraq, including...
That is elaborate.
Yeah, and it went on. And then some people, they were going to meet me, and then something happened in their neighborhood and they couldn't get to me, because that was the period of the worst stage of the Civil War. So as if I needed any more proof of what kind of danger these guys were in, and women, just having the interviews sort of showed it. So I came home with maybe 24 stories. And what I did was had each of them take me through the whole experience of the war as they had lived it. I didn't just want what's happening now, because I felt this class of people, English-speaking young Iraqis, most of them had nothing to do with journalism before or with the military before the invasion. They were doctors, they were engineers, they were students. They all were seizing something by going to work for the Americans. To them, this was hope. We offered hope.
And they were the ones that, in Iraq, who learned the most about us. They
Absolutely.
they figured us out because we're so transparent.
Exactly.
If they're on our bases and they can see what we're watching on YouTube, and they can go, this is America.
Exactly, and you just feel, quite naked in front of them. I remember this conversation I overheard between like an army captain and an Iraqi, and he kept saying, we don't want to run your country, we want you to run your country. And the Iraqi was just kind of nodding like, you want us to run it. You're going to go home as soon as possible, right? They just saw everything. And so we actually came to rely on them as cultural interpreters. I mean, what the hell? And also as security. For me, I couldn't cross the street in Baghdad without an interpreter with me to tell me, see that guy sitting over there outside that restaurant? Let's go in the other direction. I didn't pick up signs like that necessarily. So they were indispensable both to journalists and to our diplomats and soldiers and Marines.
And it was a wonderful piece, but I mean, how did you think that was?
Because I came back from that trip with their voices in my head, with these whole stories of the war. Each one of them gave me, here's where I grew up, and here's what it meant to me when the Americans came, and here were my early contacts, and they were all dramatic, really dramatic. They were like a series of events when they began to realize the Americans don't trust me, even though I'm working for them every day. The Iraqis don't trust me. Not only do they not trust me, they actually might be trying to kill me. I'll go to the Americans with that. The Americans aren't going to help me. And then the sudden, awful conclusion, I'm alone. I have nobody. I have to, and all the details of their identity cards. Yeah, they had to have 2 or 3 badges just to get into the green zone. Well, those badges were a death sentence if they got caught by the wrong people. So they would hide them in their shoes or put them under the floor mat in their car. They would erase all their friends' names from their cell phones. They would, if they got a call from their American boss on the street, they would just speak Arabic and hang up. It was very, very dramatic stuff. And I don't know, these voices stuck in my head. I felt, I'm not done with this. And I almost felt like I don't want to be in the way. The 16,000-word New Yorker piece, which is what Betrayed was, well, that was my angry attempt to make some order out of all the stories I'd heard. But I wanted their lives to be unmediated by a journalist. And the way to do that, I thought, was to let them, to make a story out of it in which there is no journalist. So a theater in New York asked me if I wanted to do a play for them. It just happened to be at that time. And I said, well, I've just written this thing, Betrayed. They said, let's see. And one thing led to another.
And you'd never written a play before. This just came.
I wrote a really bad one in college, which will go
We all
unmentioned.
did. We all
but
did.
I did have I kind of wanted to be, you know, like you, an actor for a while.
I want to be like that too.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Hope it
you
works
were
out.
and you will be. I wanted to be a stage actor, like Laurence Olivier was.
And you wrote him a letter.
My hero, I did. I said, "Dear Lord Olivier, I want to be an actor. What should I do?"
And what did he say?
And he wrote back. He actually wrote back and said, "Don't." Yeah, it's a very difficult life, and it is, and I'm glad I didn't try it. But I've always loved theater, and what's great about theater for me as a writer is I'm with other people, and I'm collaborating, and we're working together, and I'm learning from the director and from the actors, and this thing is a group project. It's taking shape as we rehearse it. The story, the script is changing every day based on the rehearsals. And then,
Which is far different than the solitary life of writing the essay where you go in there and get forehead stress fractures and
yeah.
wait for blood to come out of your eyes. And then
absolutely.
you're
I
done
mean,
and alone
it
again.
was a lot easier in a way, because sitting down with mountains of notes and recordings and printouts and then trying to turn that into something with a shape, and that's really hard.
Now, you perpetrated some bad poetry in college as well.
I did, yeah.
On this. That covers playwriting,
Yep.
nonfiction,
There's been
poetry,
a lot of that.
which you can come back to at some point and re-enter.
Only in private.
All
And
poetry is in
fiction.
private. And in fiction, you have 2 books of fiction. First, the first one came out not long after Village Awaiting, and then the second one, the Square.
Central Square.
Central Square.
Yeah.
It's been 16 years since you brought out a work of fiction. Do you feel trapped in truth?
You know,
All this truth going on around you?
mainly facts are my friends. It's reassuring for me to start with some stuff that's solid and that I've gone out and found.
You can lie from there. That's good
until
fiction.
the fact checkers at the New Yorker get a hold of it.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Have you thought about transitioning from that basis of fact and then lying your way into something which gives you a few more options? I mean, you're trapped in the truth when you write
Well,
your
that's
nonfiction pieces.
that's what the play Betrayed did. It was the first experience of imaginative writing since those 2 novels, and it was liberating. It was great to be able to invent dialogue, but I was
Convenient, too.
Yeah, very convenient. But I was sort of reassured by starting from a position of having reported it. I knew these people. Most of the dialogue in the play came directly from. I conflated characters. I made up part of the plot, but it was good to have started out as a journalist, but then to move into creative work like that was exciting. But you know, novels are they're hard. I don't take naturally to fiction. It was 10 years of going against my own grain writing those 2 novels.
And then we're kind of skipping over interesting times, writing from a turbulent decade.
It's a collection of New Yorker pieces, mostly, yeah.
And it's a lot of fun if you like the darkness that possesses us as a people, but also some wonderful studies. And this Unwinding ends up being kind of also a collection of ideas you've worked through for a while, and you've found a way to immerse yourself in the national mood by way of finding a few characters. How did you find the characters around which you kind of built your narrative line?
Well, first let me just say that this is the closest thing to a novel I've written since I wrote those 2 novels. Every line of it is fact and checkable, but it had the process of creating this felt more like the invention that goes into writing fiction, because I had to find a structure for it. I had to find a voice for every character, and there's no first person, so it kind of freed me up to allow the characters a lot of license, and the prose takes on the rhythms and diction of the characters. So this was a liberating book to write for those reasons. In 2008, I had come back from Iraq and was covering the campaign that year, and it just suddenly seemed like pillars were falling down all around us. My God, I mean, the banking system, the housing system, the car manufacturers, the whole economy, plus this incredible political campaign. It felt like, an epic year, like 1932 or something. And it began to seem like maybe we were at the end of something and the beginning of a new period. It had that feeling of a big historical transformation. So I thought that's the kind of big subject that I like to write about. Mm-hmm. But I always, as you suggested, need to find a small way through it. Not to just grab it with both hands, it's too big, but to find people. It took me a couple of years to figure out how to do it. But I met this guy named Dean Price down in North Carolina. He's a truly American original, and yet kind of deeply in the American grain. He's the son of tobacco farmers. He lives in this region that is old and traditional and very red America, and it had been tobacco and textiles, but those had gone away, and it was now on hard times. And he was trying to make something of his own life and also something in his community he had been a truck stop owner. He owned these gas stations and convenience stores, and he decided to go into biodiesel, and he was going to make his own fuel from canola oil and from waste restaurant oil and sell it as diesel fuel. But that only begins to give you a sense of why he's such a exciting person to listen to. He's a great talker, storyteller. I began to think, rather than write a whole pedestrian book about 30 years of American history, why not find 3, 4, 5 people from around the country, representative areas, a Rust Belt American. Youngstown, Ohio, Tammy Thomas. Someone from Washington, so I can get at what has happened to our government and politics during this period. It became this guy, Jeff Connaughton, who was an aide to Joe Biden, and then he became a lobbyist, and then he went back to government after the financial crisis. Silicon Valley, et cetera. So it took a mixture of luck and purposefulness to find these people. Some of them, like Dean, I just stumbled upon while working on something else. Others, like Tammy Thomas in Youngstown, by that point in the process, I needed someone in the Rust Belt, and I needed a woman. And I found...
How did you find one?
You just go to the Rust Belt and say, does anyone know any women here?
That can get you arrested.
It can, yeah. Can get you kicked out of a lot of bars. I asked a few people I knew in Cleveland and in Chicago and a couple other places, is there a story or a person who's sort of involved in trying to turn around a community that's part of the deindustrialization of this region? And 2 different people mentioned a woman named Tammy Thomas, who was a black woman from Youngstown with 3 kids. Her mother was a heroin addict. She had everything going against her. And what saved her was, and meanwhile, Youngstown was going against her because from her early teens, it went into a death spiral with the end of the steel industry, which happened faster than Detroit and more dramatically in some ways than Detroit. She got a job at a GM Auto Parts factory, one of the last assembly line jobs left in Youngstown. And for 20 years, that allowed her to survive and to raise her kids and to protect her kids. And then that job was shipped to Mexico. And she had to reinvent herself, and she became a community organizer in Youngstown, which is what she was when I met her. So, and yet, all of that sounds like it's aligned with what I was looking for. You still can't know who this person is and whether they're going to work until you've gone out to meet them and spent time together. Do they talk? Yeah. Are they willing to let you ask a lot of prying questions and hang out? You don't just go and do a quick interview. I spent weeks with these people, driving around in her car, having her show me her childhood in Youngstown, her teenage years in Youngstown, the factory that had closed down. She was willing to do that and was a more dynamic and interesting and admirable person than I had even counted on. So I got lucky. That name came up, and she turned out to be a gold mine.
So you have these very American stories
from kind of very representative areas of the US. And then within that, you intersperse our celebrities, which in some ways dictates our popular culture's perception of itself. You know, you throw Oprah in there, which is not, you didn't go interview, but you didn't need to. She's created a story that sold itself.
You're not going to get to the real Oprah. You should
So many,
focus
Jay-Z and a number of other people that you
Newt
put in there.
Gingrich, Sam Walton, Colin Powell, Robert Rubin.
They've already said what they want you to hear.
They're not going to reveal anything, and you're going to spend a lot of time and effort trying to even get an interview. I've done this for the New Yorker. VIP interviews are not my favorite thing. And then they'll have ground rules, and I need to see the quotes and blah, blah, blah.
I do that.
Yeah, I know. This escalation.
I like to change my quotes afterwards.
No, you pretty soon everyone will be doing that. It's the escalation of ground rules.
The
It's
rehistory.
the bane of reporting these days. But all of these people are very practiced at it. They'll have PR people sitting in on the interview. It's pointless. Rather, what I thought I should do is go and read them. Most of them had written autobiographies. You can learn a lot about someone from their autobiography, even if they didn't write it.
I had Doug Stanton write mine.
I read lots of interviews with them. I listened to a lot of Jay-Z's music. I read Sam Walton's Made in America and Colin Powell's My American Journey. And what I got was, I chose them partly for the walks of life. Newt Gingrich is a hugely important political figure. I think more than anyone shaped the toxic politics that we live with today. He kind of invented it, or at least mastered it back in the late 70s, early 80s. Oprah shaped our confessional pop culture. Sam Walton, this hugely successful businessman from nowhere, from little town in Oklahoma, and then set up shop in Bentonville, Arkansas. He helped create the race to the bottom, which is much of the American economy today. Amazon, I think of as a kind of Walmart for better educated people.
And you just wrote that very important piece on Amazon, yeah.
So they're sort of sprinkled throughout the book as, I think of them as like these giant stone monuments on the landscape, and we have to reckon with them. You can't write about America without thinking about our celebrities. They've replaced the institutions in some ways. They've taken the place of, there was just a story in the New York Times yesterday about how instead of government-funded scientific research, we now have billionaire-funded scientific research. We have Lawrence Ellison and Bill Gates deciding what we're going to do research on because they have the money and government doesn't. And you sort of see that across so many sectors of society. And I also wanted to have fun, so I wrote these pieces about the celebrities a bit in their voice. Like with Sam Walton, you have to get it kind of the slightly false, folksy down-home tone. With
the Waltons.
With Oprah, you have to get something about the kind of headlong, gushing sentence structure, and everything is great and getting better and better and better, except maybe not for her audience.
And in our landscape of, they sit within this landscape of disappointment generally. We don't often get to fulfill these dreams that they paint for us, but there's still these beacons of hope that if somehow you are, true in your desires, that eventually you'll persevere and you'll be able to have them. In fact, they'll recommend them for you.
Yeah.
And then you have a chance to, chase something which is really, pretty low percentage of catching.
Well, you've hit it. It's the dream. It's sort of the philosophy of positive thinking.
It's how Hollywood films emerged. You wait for the Great Depression and you go hide in someone else's perfect life.
You go into the silver screen, yeah. No, and I think at times of desperation, I'm thinking, of times of great gaps between wealthy and ordinary Americans. The 20s is a good example. That's kind of when modern celebrity was born, with advertising and movies, The Great Gatsby. And it's the kind of time we live in now. when the gap gets so great, people start to live through them. And even though we maintain that American idea of winning the lottery, people sort of have stopped believing it, really. And when Jay-Z, I heard him give a concert at the new arena in Brooklyn, right near where I live, while I was writing The Unwinding, and Jay-Z's in it. He talked as if his success was their success, was his audience's success. And his audience would flash the corporate logo of Jay-Z's music and clothing business, as if they were kind of part of the deal. And that
The share owners.
Yeah, it stuck with me. Like, they identified with him and his lifestyle in a way that suggested they had stopped thinking that it was their own lives. And when we hear that, if I can do it, you can do it, we kind of know that that's not true. You don't have to do it. I'm already doing it. I'm doing it for you. Give me your ambitions, and I'll do it. And that's kind of the role celebrities play today. They don't rise with the rest of the country. They rise from it. And we live through them more intensely than I think is healthy.
That's kind of an amazing quote. Could we hear that again? You were heavily influenced by Orwell in your early years.
Yes.
And Orwell kind of classified his time, the 20th century, as imperialism, communism, and fascism. He's not around.
Right.
You are, and The Unwinding is kind of something I think he would have enjoyed reading. What do you think has replaced his kind of categories? Is it now the internet, and how many other things do we have? What do you kind of feel define currently our problems as much as our strengths?
That's a good question. Orwell was my MFA program. I just read all of his books in my 20s. I was working in construction, and I remember during lunch breaks I was buried deeply in Animal Farm.
I raise animals, and I'm very suspicious of them now.
Yes, you never know.
Those chickens look weird.
Keep an eye on them. You might
at you sideways.
make sure your security is good.
Goat eyes are weird looking.
Yeah. So, Orwell really, as much as anyone, gave me an idea of what a nonfiction writer could be. I didn't even know what nonfiction was. It didn't exist in my head. Did you study nonfiction in school? When I was in English, in high school English, we read novels and poetry and plays. But I read Homage to Catalonia on my way back from Africa.
We just read Ethan Frome.
Which is...
over and over.
It's good. That's depressing.
Wasn't that bad, actually.
Yeah. Something about that bleak New England landscape, though.
Yeah, well, I was living in it.
Well, no wonder you've gone from upstate New York to upstate Michigan.
Yeah.
It's in your soul. Homage to Catalonia was my first exposure, like how great nonfiction could be. It's literature, too. So your question is a good one. I mean, we don't live in an age of ideologies like Orwell. We don't live in a time, and thank God, when a really powerful and terrible idea could take hold of millions of people and lead them to go off and kill millions of other people, which is what was true in his time. We have our smaller ideas, and I don't even know if they deserve the ism at the end. But I mean, we certainly
aren't those small ideas affecting large
Well,
movements
I'm going to mention two or three. One is American exceptionalism, which
is true.
Are you being Stephen Colbert?
George, why do you hate America?
Yeah, I knew that was coming. Well, it was true in people's minds, which is really all that matters, because that's where
truth is.
History is made. And in a way, Iraq is the story of what happens when some very powerful people get a very aggressive and simple idea of American exceptionalism into their heads. That's what the Assassin's Gate is about.
Right.
But I think that has really been eclipsed. Americans do not want to spread freedom around the world. We are in a period of profound retrenchment where if Obama didn't say a word about Ukraine or Syria I don't think a lot of the country would think we're failing our mission overseas. There would be some, but not that many, because we are focused on ourselves. I think maybe the big ism that I see in a lot of areas of our culture is libertarianism. It's really powerful. You see it in the tech world, in Silicon Valley, at Amazon. You see it in the Tea Party. Mm-hmm. And it's this disbelief in authority and in institutions and in collective action. I think it's a false idea of human life. You know, we're not alone. We don't make it by ourselves. Everyone is interconnected in some way. And the idea that we're all entrepreneurs just hacking our way through the jungle of the economy by ourselves toward the mother lode, which is kind of like the libertarian fantasy out in California, it's just a false idea, but it's very powerful, especially for younger people. And it's partly like part of the disbelief and skepticism that's settled over so many Americans. Like government is irrelevant or worse, it's negative, and so are any big traditional institution. So I think libertarianism is a pretty powerful ism in our life.
Do you think that's affecting the way we think about evidence? We seem to be having a huge part of our population is predisposed to despise evidence now. And it's almost more this strange dissonance between what we believe and what's true. Because if you believe it, isn't that as true as anything could be?
Right.
Versus
right. Everyone has their own truth.
Everyone has their own truth.
Yeah.
Is that part of this? Is that beginning to erode our ability to reason with anything other than kind of strange, ambitious political ideas?
I'll answer with an example. During the 2008 campaign, I was in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, not far from here, and just trying to get a feel for how the Obama-Clinton race in the primaries was going. And I was talking to an editor at the Eau Claire Leader-Telegram, the local paper. Mm-hmm. And he said to me, we used to get real letters to the editor, where like some crank in his living room would write, you don't know what you're talking about, and blah, blah. And he welcomed them, because like everyone had the right, and it was a good thing for them to express themselves. Now, he said, what I get are talking points, and they all read the same. As if, RNC Central or DNC Central dictated them, sent out an email blast, which is probably what happened. So he saw the same language in letter after letter that came down from Fox News or from MSNBC.
Is that destroying our use of language? The repetition of language to the point where it becomes meaningless, like patriotism was destroyed by the Iraq War. Are we taking some of our powerful words and just using them?
Yeah, you're leading me down a dangerous road, because I'm a bit of a crank myself, and because I'm a bit critical of the technology world, I've become known as a curmudgeon, and I do recognize that
good word.
A sense of decline, which is related to the unwinding,
right,
can be confused with having just turned 50, and maybe it's my own decline that I'm really writing about. So I'm wary of saying everything is bad and it was better before, because I recognize that that's the way people my age sound, and it's really annoying. On the other hand, things have gotten worse. For example, newspapers. We used to have these community newspapers like the Eau Claire Leader-Telegram that provided news that local people used in order to figure out what life was like for them and what the main problems were. And this editor was telling me that's not what we do anymore. We don't have enough money for reporting. So we have columnists, and a lot of them are columnists in Washington. So we're getting this national noise instead of local news, which is actually based in facts. I saw the same thing during that same campaign year in southeastern Ohio, in this little town called Gloucester, where I went into this diner on Main Street for breakfast, and everyone sounded like a cable news anchor. They had all been watching.
That'd be a great scene.
It was weird. It was.
That's excellent coffee jar.
It was sort of Twin Peaks-like, I guess.
Thank you, Bob.
Remember Twin Peaks?
Back to you.
Yeah. No, it was like, well, do you think Palin's going to get a bounce out of the convention, you know, or her negative's going to be too high? And it was this. It's not that there was anything wrong with talking that way. It just seemed as if people were no longer talking about their own lives. They had been taken over by cable news. And so what's replaced the idea of a kind of independent-minded and at least aspiring toward objective media is a lot of noise and opinion, which is cheap. Reporting costs money. I know, I can tell you that Betrayed piece cost a lot of money. Yeah. Opinion is very cheap, and as the media have been hollowed out by the internet and by the loss of advertising and some of their own mistakes, they've turned to this, and I think it has made it harder for Americans to agree on a body of facts. As a starting point, we'll have arguments, but at least let's accept a certain reality in common.
Are we losing context? I think that's what the stories seem to be thinning out. They get to the point, like, you know, airplane missing, period. And we're kind of like, what the hell happened? You're like, right. Wouldn't you like to know?
Yeah.
You know, tune in tomorrow and we'll say one more word. Aircraft missing, likely gone.
Well,
what does that mean?
That was sort of what the Malaysians were saying.
Yeah.
It was a little hard to figure that story out. In fact, we still haven't figured that story out. But, you know, there's still great journalism, and there's still a desire for it. I mean, if you read a really good newspaper or a really good magazine or watch good news or listen to good news on the radio, you can be informed. It's not impossible. It's just unlikely because there is so much noise.
All right. We're going to take questions in just a heartbeat, but I wanted to address one more thing, and that's the greatest task of someone who's written a masterful tome on the American soul. And now you've been asked to turn this into a screenplay, which is yet another genre off your list. We're running out.
Yeah. And it's a hard one.
Yeah. This is such a hard
400 pages is easy, but like just a little dialogue, that's really hard.
And so you're just going into that now, which is
interesting.
interesting.
Yeah, just starting it. It's a little adventure and experiment. I don't know if it's going to work. It seems like a producer who said, oh, let's turn this into a movie is a really ambitious person, because I don't know if we've given the audience a sense of the structure, but this book covers 35 years, and it does it by introducing you to a handful of these people we've been talking about, and then you leave them and meet someone else, and then you hear about Newt Gingrich, and then you come back to the first, and then you meet Oprah Winfrey, and then so it's this kaleidoscopic structure, and it asks a lot of readers. I think you're
pulling from that noise throughout this book. You're pulling from the advertisements, from the slogans, from all these things keep on emerging as kind of the background collage of who we are at certain periods of time. I really like the way you divided it and used kind of, who we're telling each other to be and what we're telling each other to buy as kind of our back piece,
by taking out the first person, which I'd always used in nonfiction, what I got to do was allow the characters to talk and not have to explain it all and not have to come to a conclusion. And a lot of reviewers faulted me for that, but that was my intent. I did not want to give you a little tidy what's wrong with America and how to fix it. I wanted to plunge you into the stream of history through these stories and have you find yourself through that.
We'll eventually get you to be a pundit, and you can rewrite it the way we want it. But could you read a little piece of this for us?
Sure.
And then we'll take questions.
Let's see if I can. So this is the beginning of part 2, and this is about Dean Price, the guy from North Carolina. At this point, he owns these truck stops. His business is starting to go south with the early housing bust, and he's thinking he needs to do something different, but he doesn't yet know what. A 2-lane asphalt road ran past the woods, white oak, shagbark hickory, Carolina ash. And in the shadows of the trees, a tobacco barn was year by year collapsing on itself, the metal roof sloping inward, pieces of bare siding hanging loose from nails. Nearby, a white clapboard house with empty windows squatted at the roadside, half smothered in tree branches and vines, while a fire-scorched, handwritten sign on the outside wall still advertised, "Crush." Farther along, the road took a turn, and a tidy brick ranch house with a big satellite dish mounted on top stood in the golden sunlight of a red-brown field. Another bend, a gentle hill, deep woods again, then an abandoned metal warehouse alone in a clearing. The road straightened and flattened and came to a stoplight where a pair of strip malls faced each other, parking lots full, a Walgreens across from McDonald's, Shell opposing BP. Another light, a shuttered car dealership, a vast scrapyard with a mountain of twisted metal and stacked timbers, next door to a spinning mill that was being methodically gutted like a great whale and sold off one part at a time. Then downtown, the lonely little Main Street, a taekwondo studio, a government benefits office, a closed restaurant, a nameless corner store for rent, 2 pedestrians in 4 blocks, a Dollar General that marked the far end of town. On the other side, the country opened up at once, the road passing fields, corn planted on one, nothing on the next, and then a residential development with 2-story look-alike houses in neat rows laid out across someone's former tobacco farm. And beyond the subdivision, isolated on acres of grass behind a split-rail fence and a man-made lake, the supersized faux chateau of a celebrity NASCAR driver. The landscape Dean had returned to, where he planned to live out his life, was very old and also new, as particular as anything in America, and also as generic, as beautiful and as ugly. In his imagination, it had become a nightmare, so profoundly wrong that he called it sinful, and he hated the sin more than any casual visitor or distant critic possibly could. Yet he also saw here a dream of redemption, so unlikely and glorious that it could only fill the mind's eye of a visionary native son. Once, driving through Cleveland County, Dean happened to pass the Hard-Shell Baptist Church that his father had once tried to get, but failed, the failure that had broken his father's will. Dean had gone down with his father to Cleveland County and heard the sermon that he had given for his audition back around 1975, so that decades later he recognized the church. And he also noticed that there was now a fucking Bojangles right next door. For Dean, Bojangles had come to represent everything that was wrong with the way Americans lived, how they raised their food and transported it across the country, how they grew the crops to feed the animals they ate, the way they employed the people who worked in the restaurants, the way the money left the community. Everything about it was wrong. Dean's own business, gas and fast food, had become hateful to him, and he saw the error of his ways as his father never had, and the conjunction of his father's legacy and his own struck him with bitter irony as he drove past. He was seeing beyond the surfaces of the land to its hidden truths. Some nights, he sat up late on his front porch with a glass of Jack and listened to the trucks heading south on 220, carrying crates of live chickens to the slaughterhouses, always under cover of darkness, like a vast and shameful trafficking. Chickens pumped full of hormones that left them too big to walk. And he thought how these same chickens might return from their destination as pieces of meat to his floodlit Bojangles up the hill from his house. And that meat would be drowned in the bubbling fryers by employees whose hatred of the job would leak into the cooked food. And that food would be served up and eaten by customers who would grow obese and end up in the hospital in Greensboro with diabetes or heart failure, a burden to the public. And later, Dean would see them riding around the Mayodan Walmart in electric carts because they were too heavy to walk the aisles of a supercenter, just like hormone-fed chickens. Thank you. Thank you.
love that. It won the National Book Award, by the way, which isn't bad.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming tonight. Let's take some wonderful questions. They'll be wonderful, I know it. Someone right over here, front row. Hold on, we got a mic coming for your voice to be powerful.
So what newspapers do we read?
There's still a few good papers. I mean, I read the New York Times. It's still a great paper.
The Independent?
Is it independent?
The Independent in England?
The Independent of London? I read The Guardian. I read the Washington Post. And who has time? I mean, that's about it. There are these great papers, but how do we read? We read by searching on Google and finding an article, rather than, I actually still subscribe to the print edition of the New York Times, which makes me a real curmudgeon. I mean, like, I hardly know anyone who does.
That's old guard, man.
Yeah, yeah. There's good journalism on the web, but the web doesn't pay for reporting. It just doesn't have the financial structure. So every day you read about some billionaire who has started a new media enterprise, and your hopes rise, and you think, great, Jeff Bezos now owns the Washington Post. He's going to spend some real money on it, and I think he probably will. But the web has not figured out how to pay for the incredibly costly enterprise called reporting, and so often it gets dumbed down and turned into punditry and opinion, because that doesn't cost much money. So no one's figured it out.
We have a generation that expects things free as well.
People expect, maybe the biggest mistake of all was for newspapers to allow their stuff to be given away for free, because how could you do that? How are you going to go on paying for it if you give it away for free?
And you can't go back.
They're trying. They're setting up subscription plans and paywalls, and if you really want it, you'll pay for it, but I think they'll lose some readers that way. So we're in this upheaval where the whole industry has just been turned inside out and is trying to figure out how to go on doing it. I think what I am sure of is that people still want it. People really do want to know what's going on in the world. And so sooner or later, somehow, I think this will find a new platform, a new form of expression. But right now, it's kind of endangered.
Where's the best long-form journalism being done?
Can I say the New Yorker? I still think the New Yorker is, the best long-form journalism. In some ways, practically the only. How many other There's Harper's. The Atlantic doesn't really do it much anymore. I mean, there's just Texas Monthly used to be great. Maybe still
Rolling
is.
Stone does some surprisingly good stuff.
Yeah, Rolling Stone sometimes, Esquire sometimes, but that is truly the endangered species, because like this piece I wrote on Amazon, it got tweeted a lot, but almost every tweet began with long, like L-O-O-O-O-N-G, piece by George Packer, like, it's not that long, it's 12,000 words. Maybe it's long compared to a tweet.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, if people are tweeting it to each other, that's like 12,000 tweets.
I mean, I know, you sort of think, God, if you're reading all these tweets and then you're going to go try to read my piece, you might as well try to crack War and Peace. It's just too, yeah.
Interesting. There's hope. It's just thin. Yeah. It's right here.
Hello. I own a bookstore in Traverse City, and I did read the Amazon piece word for word. So I'm torn. Do I ask you to riff on that piece, or do I ask for the kernel of hope in the future of independent bookstores? Your choice.
I think as the public wises up to, is it Horizon Books? Yeah, we were in there earlier today.
You can buy this there.
It looked wonderful, and I've done an endless book tour for the Unwinding, and I've been in a lot of independent bookstores, and so I actually have a sort of sanguine view about them. There's a lot of thriving, or at least doing fine, independents out there, partly because the big chains are getting killed off. So there's some, little room in the forest for the smaller trees. But if the public wises up and cares not just about bookstores, but about books, that was, to me, the message of that piece. It's not just that Amazon is a threat to independent bookstores. We've known that forever. Amazon, by the way it is disrupting, which is a favorite word of the tech community, the publishing and writing and reading of books is making it harder and harder for good books to get paid for and written. Because in a way, as I said, the Walmart for educated people, we have a self-publishing platform, which seems like a wonderful thing. Anyone can now get their book published. That's great. Who can be against that? Except that Amazon owns it. Amazon gets bigger and bigger, and people who use it don't even seem to know there's a giant corporation behind this. They think it's like a public utility, like the highways. No, Kindle it's owned by a giant corporation that is sucking, the dollars out of it. It's not just that, though. It means that as Amazon lays waste to to all these other structures, bookstores, libraries, book publishers, that's another thing I discovered writing that piece. They really are trying to put the New York publishers to some degree out of business, which is strange because the New York publishers are their suppliers. And yet Amazon has big ambitions. They want to be the publisher. The tech word for this is disintermediation, which basically means clear-cutting the forest until there are no gatekeepers left. There's no one between the reader and the writer except this benign leviathan called Amazon. That makes me really nervous.
Benign leviathan?
I'm scare quotes around benign.
You can't even tweet that.
You could. That makes me very nervous because, first of all, that much power in one corporation's hands, to me, is dangerous. There used to be, there was a lawsuit against Apple and the publishers for colluding to raise prices. Some people wondered, why wasn't the lawsuit against Amazon for owning 92% of the ebook market at one point? If that's not a monopoly, what is? So any monopoly is dangerous, and a monopoly over books, intellectual content, very dangerous. Plus, it is changing the way authors are paid and essentially making them into partners with Amazon, which, again, might be a nice thing if you can't get your book published in New York, but in the end, what it means is editing and marketing and paying in advance so that you can spend 3 years working on the Unwinding is becoming a thing of the past.
Plus, they can price set on their own. Like every once in a while, they just make my book, $2.
They'll throw it out there for nothing.
They can do.
For nothing. And the theory is lower price means more readers, but I don't think that's true. I think people will buy books if they want those books, and they'll pay a little more if they really want those books. But if the price goes down to 99 cents a book and a book is a widget, that's not good for writers. And I don't even think in the long run it's good for readers because it's going to make it harder for writers to write good books. So I think if the public wises up to this, and the way Walmart created a reaction and brought a sort of a revival of Main Street, such as here, and the mall became kind of considered a threat to the economic health of a community, well, I think maybe people will begin to feel the same way about the online giant Amazon.
Now, what are we going to do with all our malls?
Well, the
zombie films?
The recession kind of created, a weird ghost mall out there. Yeah.
How about someone from the upstairs? Anybody? We don't want to leave the upstairs.
There's a bunch of people down here.
All right.
When are you going to run for president?
Oh, God. God forbid.
God's forbid?
That is a terrible thought. It's the opposite of being a writer. being president. And I think Obama would have been a better writer than president, and may be a better writer than president. I think he's a really good man and a very good writer, and the presidency may be an impossible job at this point, and he may not quite have what you need to make the presidency work today. But a friend of mine once wrote a profile of him before he was Barack Obama. Like, he was a nobody running for the Senate in Illinois. And after a long day of trailing Obama and getting all this access, because back then he could, because Obama didn't have anyone trailing him, Obama turned to my friend and said, I'd really rather do what you're doing. Instead of going out and having to give all the speeches, I'd rather be hanging back and watching, writing things down, and then write about it. I think that's kind of who Obama is, except that now he's not that person anymore because he's become president. I think it's a soul-crushing job, an impossible job. And I like the career I have, so I'm not going to do anything crazy.
Back here. So you might address this in the book, but some of these institutions that you're talking about being unwound, do you think they can or should be rewound at some point, or is it good that in some way that some of these are being dismantled?
Disrupted, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the negative view, the critical view of my book would be that I just don't want history to happen. And maybe we had this 40, 50-year interlude from the Great Depression to the 70s when there was pretty widespread prosperity with groups of Americans locked out, but the ability to correct itself. And there was a social contract, and government management and labor kind of had to cooperate with each other. And that was all an accident of history. It was all about emerging triumphant from World War II. It was all about not having global competition economically. It was all about the Cold War and the bipartisanship that came out of the Cold War. And now we're kind of settling back into normal American history, which is Darwinian and ferocious and has winners and losers and is highly individualistic. So that's one view. And in that view, you should look to Seattle and San Francisco for the future, where instead of institutions, we have entrepreneurs who are laying waste to institutions and are creating new forms of economic life that don't need structures, don't need hierarchies, don't need legacies or traditions. Amazon's a great example. And we'll lay waste to a lot of that. I'm going to criticize the criticism, but hesitantly, because I think that's a powerful argument. That's the best argument against my book, I think. But I would say, without those institutions, without social structures, what happens is organized money wins. That is what happens in American life when we weaken government, schools, the media, the sort of enlightened impulses of business that recognize that we actually have a country that needs to be paid attention to, and it's not all about quarterly earnings. When we have labor unions, when we have different structures, each of which represents different interests, but they have to cooperate. I think that without that, organized money wins. And that's where we are today. So if we're going to have science in this country, we have to rely on the whims and benevolence of billionaires. If we're going to have decent public schools, we have to hope that Mark Zuckerberg ponies up for the Newark school system. If we're going to have a books business, we have to hope that Oprah starts a book club. This is why celebrities have become so gigantic, because they've taken the place of these institutions. And I think in the end, in all of these areas, what the tech people think of as democratization, like I heard a lot about that from Amazon. We're democratizing books. We're just making it possible for everybody to publish their book. In field after field, whether it's books, culture, politics, business, democratization really means concentration of wealth in a few hands, because you've taken away the sort of the intermediate structures that mitigate against that. And without those, if they're weak, if the school system is weak, if the newspapers are weak, we end up with a plutocracy. And that's where we're headed today. So whether or not they can be rebuilt, I think without trying to rebuild those key institutions of society, we're going to end up with more and more a country of haves and have-nots, of big winners and big losers. And that's not a future I want.
This is a little hard to ask, but there was a PBS series that speaks a little bit about the large corporation and Amazon called God in America. And it goes over 400 years, and it speaks about the dissident religious persons who were against the grain and caused these movements that helped the U.S. find its narrative again. Like it was lost, then it came back through this idea of an individual experience with God. And I was absolutely flabbergasted by it because it kept coming back to who are we, who are we, who are we? And the answer was these dissident movements recovering an individual's personal experience with God. And it's always enchanted me because I agree with this question we're in. Where is our country now? Who are we now? Can you speak a little bit to that? It's a little bit of a complicated question to ask, but I think we all are looking for who are we today, and there's a sense of our history, not just that a couple of George Washington prayed once, it goes beyond that, but...
Well, I didn't see that film, but I think it's more complicated than that because we're different things. And at the same time that the Puritans, who were the dissidents who came here and set up, little religious communities based on the idea of a free conscience and the direct relation with God, we were also these sort of philosopher-statesmen who created the country through the Declaration and through the Constitution and looked to like the Roman Republic as their model. And we're also the first, really sort of capitalist entrepreneurs of that time who began to amass a lot of wealth in the early years of the Republic. The historian Gordon Wood, who's one of the great historians of the early Republic, has beautiful books about these different strains, religious conscience, political purpose, and capitalist impulse. And I think we're all of that. And they come and go, and one of them has the upper hand and another does, and maybe all of us individually are made up of those different elements. I just think it's dangerous when one of them dominates to the expense of maybe even the extinction of the other two. And I think it's pretty obvious that right now we're in a period of, intense capitalist overdrive without the mitigating sense of the community and whether people are being left behind or whether people are disposable. There's a family in the Unwinding, because Tampa is one of the main locations of the book during the housing bust. And there's a family down there called the Hartzels who are part of the Unwinding. The family of four who've stuck together without any means of support, a Walmart job, basically, part-time, $8.50 an hour job at Walmart. And that was keeping the family going, and then that stopped. They feel so disposable, like there's just no part of our society that wants them or needs them. And for large numbers of Americans to feel that way, like they have no productive work they can do. They have no contribution that society needs and wants from them. That is just a dangerous state of affairs. And that, in the tech economy, has created more and more of those people because it's taken away a lot of the jobs people like that used to do. And so has the globalized economy. There's to some extent, not much we can do about that, except remember that we're not just about efficiency, which is what Amazon is about. We're about other things too, like what you were describing eloquently a minute ago.
You spoke a moment ago about haves and have-nots. The fall of the Roman Empire did the same thing. Are we in for 1,500 years of medieval dark age?
Right. Will there be monks with iPads, trying to hold on to what's left of American culture in little isolated pockets of the Upper Peninsula? And yeah.
If we're going to start building with marble, though, I'm kind of in favor.
Man, I hope not. I think we're probably in better shape than the Roman Empire. We have this really resourceful and resilient population. We still have, great universities, great centers of culture, and a spirit that hasn't died. It's just kind of lost its way. So I don't like talking about the future because I'm not an expert on it, and I don't trust anyone who claims to be. But I do think that there's a long history of recovery in America from periods that may have looked grimmer than this one, the 30s, the Civil War. And it usually is a matter of people finding new ways to reaffirm old values. And how do you do that? I don't know. I'm not capable of articulating that, but I don't completely despair. Like, if you read The Unwinding, you'll meet people in it, like Dean Price and Tammy Thomas, who've, far from giving up, they just keep at it and keep adapting and rethinking and remaking themselves, and that's an American, I think, a real American gift.
Yeah, despite, how much dark information there is in this book about the pressures that we're receiving as a society, I always, people think, well, this must feel defeatist. And everyone you chose, in the end, they're still dreaming. That's what I think is amazing about this book. It gives us all the reasons for dreams to fail, and dreams persevere. People continue. These people didn't give up, haven't given up, and based on the trajectory you've given them, aren't going to give up, which I think is something that that you believe.
Yeah, people can't give up. What does it mean to give up? It's pretty desperate, and there's we were talking about earlier about the danger of ideas, and they can be dangerous if you take them too far, or if you ignore reality, or if you imagine yourself to be infallible. But if it's a modest idea, like maybe biodiesel is the answer to the problems of rural North Carolina, that is a lifeline. It's more than just getting by. It's more than just putting food on the table. It gives Dean Price a reason to get up in the morning and get into his beat-up old Honda and put a few hundred more miles on it, driving around county to county trying to sign up the school districts on this idea of putting biodiesel in their school buses. I went on many of those trips with him and saw, he had to come back from so many setbacks and defeats. He went bankrupt. He even contemplated suicide. But this idea, which to him had a religious component to it, kept him going. So there isn't, I think it's important to live for something beyond the immediate and beyond the day-to-day and beyond yourself. It gives you hope.
We have time for one more quick question. If somebody has one.
Someone up on top. There, sir.
Up in the peanut gallery here.
Way up there.
Hello.
George, up on top there.
Yes. Hi.
Hello.
It's hard to see with these lights.
If we were working with the idea of unwinding, can you give us a moment in which we were really wound? And from your answer to the prior question, have there been other moments in which they were wound, unwound, and rewound, or unknit and reknit? Can you give us a few of those points, but particularly the one where we were really wound?
You know, I don't see it as being a state of perfection or a state of completeness, because that never happens. There's always this process of becoming and of striving, and there's always a mix of, I mean, for example, you could say the post-war period was the best period for the middle class in history for any country.
World War II.
Post-World War II period, where we had a standard of living that was rising for more people. This prosperity was shared more widely. There was more of a sense of opportunity. There were better public schools than there'd ever been, and maybe than there are today. And there was more job security. You didn't have to have a college degree to be able to support a family, et cetera, et cetera. But you could also say, well, that same period saw the death throes of segregation in the South, and they were really violent and ugly death throes. It saw a period of, in which women were essentially confined to one part of life. Gay people were non-entities. I would say what made that a healthier period than today is that we still had those structures and institutions that could correct what was wrong. For example, the civil rights movement, it was a mass movement from the streets and the churches, but it was also government and labor unions and even businesses that saw that it was necessary for social peace and progress to support this. And that's partly why it prevailed against really steep odds in the South. So today, we have all these problems that we all know about: global warming, inequality and wage stagnation, debt, and we could go on and on. Gun violence, et cetera, et cetera.
But people aren't in the streets.
And we don't seem to have the tools to fix them. We have a Congress that is absolutely blocked. When you go to Washington, you just feel this paralysis settling over you. Like, nothing can happen here. Nothing good will come of this place. I was just there last week. I was asked to testify before the Senate Finance Committee about the unwinding, believe it or not. That's how desperate they are.
We've read your book. And
I sat down and looked up at the senators on at the committee and just felt this sense of despair settling over me. Like, I know nothing's going to come of this. We don't have those tools because, for lots of complicated reasons, they've broken down and they've been replaced by organized money, and you see that nowhere as clearly as in Washington. So I do think there were periods where things worked better, and there was more of a sense of inclusiveness and of opportunity being shared, at least opportunity, if not results. And you go back through our history, and we do seem to keep going through these convulsions where something wrong, some seemingly unresolvable conflict then comes to a head, and the Civil War is maybe the example. And I don't know what the mechanism of rebuilding those post-war institutions will be, but I do know that without them, or without something to take their place, we're all at the mercy of the market. And the market is not kind to most people. All the numbers that you're not familiar with about inequality, to me, are a sign of what happens when society stops trying to make life better for middle-class people and instead essentially says, you're on your own.
All right, well, it's up to you, America.
Look, thanks. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ben, for doing this. I'm a big admirer of Ben's and of his writing, too. And thank you all for coming out. And I have to say, this sounded a little depressing, but I do think this book will not depress you. If you read it, there'll be new.
It's strangely hopeful, as I was saying. You know, it's got all the evidence for the opposite, but it still has this this true spirit, which I think we're all seeking to restore to a larger American mass. Stay hopeful. Pick up a copy. It's outside, and you can have it personalized by George Packer.
Thanks.
Right now. Thank you.